if the Big Ten door is closed for Duke, there's no SEC home. Like, what do you do? I mean, do you stay in a reworked ACC? And I think that's an option for the ACC.
I am joined now by Andrew Carter from the News and Observer. He is based in Raleigh. Well, where does NC State factor in here, right? Because it seems like, and again, this is where I need your expertise, but just from following this on the outside looking in, I have been at least a little bit surprised at the amount of influence it appears that the Board of Governors in the state of North Carolina has, that NC State has on that board, right? And you've got the Board of Trustees at UNC and the Board of Governors, a lot of people involved here. But how much influence does NC State have, and is that enough to potentially keep them tied at the hip of North Carolina, wherever it is that they're going to go?
It's a great question. People here have been trying to figure it out. I've written about it a time or two. You know, I went to a Board of Governors meeting several months ago and tried to get folks on the record, you know, when they were considering passing that legislation in terms of the Board of Governors. And eventually they did. Basically, that makes it more difficult for a state institution to consider a realignment opportunity. They basically have to get approval from the Board of Governors before they pursue an opportunity to go to a different conference. And that goes beyond the ACC. That's every state school in North Carolina. You're right. I mean, there's a lot of NC State influence on the Board of Governors. You have folks, in fact, the guy who was the president of that organization, Randy Ramsey, he is a huge Wolfpack Club guy. Like, he's a huge NC State booster going back decades. And his term actually just ended. I think it was yesterday. We wrote a story about it. And so he's done. But yeah, I mean, you still have like folks who are NC State alums or documented NC State athletics fans or supporters among that group that's going to be making decisions. And I do think to a degree, it's a little bit of a sort of a difficult pill for UNC folks to swallow, because forever UNC had that kind of sway and power. If you go back, I mean, UNC, you know, the history of the institution, UNC is arguably, it goes back and forth with Virginia. They fight over which school is like the oldest public university in the country. UNC was founded, I think, like 1789. And NC State opened up about 100 years later. And so that's, you know, that's a century worth of influence and power to overcome to a degree. And, you know, I think NC State has caught up to some degree. And you have to remember, this goes back a bit to what I was talking about in terms of the political forces and influences in this state. So North Carolina is unique in that it has a Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, but it has a state legislature controlled by Republicans. And those are the folks who appoint members of the Board of Governors. And so, like, a right-leaning legislature is going to appoint more conservative folks. And it just so happens, like, the political leanings of both institutions, like NC State historically is a more conservative institution. So it's benefited a bit more from that conservative legislature appointing members of this group to make decisions about higher ed throughout the state. So that gives you an idea of, you know, some of the forces at play. Like, how much of it is going to matter ultimately? That's like the $1 million question. Like, if UNC has an offer eventually and they go through the steps and they document like, hey, like, we're going to make a boatload more money in the SEC or Big Ten. Like, I don't see a scenario in which these folks like on the BOG just get together and like, no, like, we're not going to allow you to do that because we want NC State and UNC to be in the same conference. Like, I think they can make the process more difficult. I think you could see a scenario conceivably of what happened in California, where UCLA, I guess, has to pay like a certain amount of money to Cal, basically for leaving Cal behind. I think maybe you can have a similar thing like that here if it came to it. But it has to come to it first. And that's a question to me is like, you know, a lot of it depends on what happens with these lawsuits facing the ACC. You know, I tend to think that we're a ways away from like finding out if NC State and UNC are going to be tied together. I mean, you know, there are some high-level politicians within North Carolina who want those schools to be together. but like, it's not like there's a law on the books that says it has to be so. Like, so I wonder, like, when it comes down to it, what can you do if like there's this inevitable split that's going to happen? If UNC has a great offer at some point, I mean, they probably already do. But like, how does that work in a very technical, mechanical sense if you're trying to tie them together? I just don't, it doesn't make sense to me. It's something to talk about, and I understand why it has become such a talking point. But like, ultimately, these folks, you can have all like the political capital and power in the world, but if it's not like illegal, if there's not like some hard and fast law on the books, like what can be done to stop it is my question. You can put in these, again, like what they did in California. Okay, could see that. Maybe you force them to play each other every year in football, which they should do anyway, because people care about that game. People care about, when they play each other in basketball, even though UNC has been so dominant. But stuff like that I can see. But in terms of like, tying them together, I just don't understand like how in practice that would work. Would be my answer.
Yeah, I get it. Well, you mentioned the triangle, right? The other piece here is Duke. And so I wonder what you think the future of Duke is in all of this. Obviously, that will depend on a number of factors and what happens with the ACC, but like what options does Duke have in all of this?
I mean, to me, it depends on how big some of these conferences get. Like what is the final number for the SEC and Big Ten? I mean, how much, like, I lose track even of what they're going to be this year. So the SEC is going to be 16 this year, I think, right? That's right. Big Ten is going to be 18.
Yeah.
So that's 34. And then, like, what's the final number? Is it 224? Like school leagues? Do you get to, it starts to get unwieldy, I think, if you go beyond 24 in each. So the question is like, can Duke be, can they rest a spot at the table, sneak in there in that final group and maybe I think they would fit in the Big Ten academically, culturally. They don't really fit in terms of like the huge state school, huge alumni thing. Basketball wise, I'm sure either one would love to have them, but I think there's a lot of concern at Duke. Excuse me, because Duke, and here's another thing I think the listeners should know. It's like, it's easy to look at the ACC and be like, oh, that's a basketball conference. They only care about basketball. That's the only thing people are into. I mean, Duke has put a ton of money in football. And you can make the argument, well, maybe it's too little too late. But if you look at Wallace Wade Stadium now, their football stadium, and compare to where it was, in terms of like what it looked like, how rinky dink it was, it had a track around it up until I think they finally removed that in 2013 or 14. I can't remember. But they've put like a ton of money, like in facilities upgrades. They've built a nice press box. They've built a nice, like, special suite area for people. Like their old press box, literally they were sharing the space. It was a doctor's office that overlooked the field there. It was like a doctor's office building next to the stadium. They had like a third or fourth story, like waiting area for physicians and whatnot. And they would convert it into a press box every weekend for game days. Like really, really kind of absurd. So they fixed that. They've done a lot of stuff, weight rooms, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's totally different. They have invested. Wake Forest has invested a ton, like a similarly sized school, same kind of missions, both high level academic institutions, but Duke and Wake. I mean, the investment has been there. The question is like, is the interest, do these mega conferences care about that? What value? And like, you hate to distill all this stuff down to like numbers on a spreadsheet. Like, I don't think that's good necessarily, because I think a lot of these schools have like value that you can't tie to money. Going back to NC State, like the NC State Carolina rivalry in football, people really care about that in North Carolina. Is it going to be among the top 25 watch games in the country every year? No. Does that mean like it's totally irrelevant? Like, I don't think so. Same thing. Like, everyone knows about Duke Carolina basketball. And yeah, that's this huge national phenomenon. ESPN has hyped it for years and years and years. But, you know, in football, UNC fans get up for that. Duke football fans, we can joke. There are some Duke football fans out there. They care about that and get up for the victory bell. And it's like, I have concerns about what all this stuff does for like the culture of college sports in North Carolina, because I feel like North Carolina to me is like the ideal college sports state. And we get so wrapped up in, boy, how many people are watching this game or that, or what were the ratings, or what's your TV contract? Well, again, like a lot of the stuff, like it goes beyond numbers. You know, like how do you put like a dollar sign on some of this stuff? How do you put a dollar sign on the history of it and the culture and growing up here with these rivalries and the connections? It's just different. It's unlike anywhere else in the country. And so for it to be potentially torn apart, you know, as someone who grew up here, who I feel like I understand the culture of it, like it may, you know, I mourn it. And yet on the other hand too, like the ACC is not the ACC if you have two schools from California and one from Dallas coming in. Like that's also absurd. So, you know, in a way, like it hasn't been what it was for a long time. But I still, you know, I still mourn what the state especially has had. And I'm concerned that, you know, it's going away. And once it's gone, like you can ruin it. Like to me, it's like that old comparison of NASCAR. Like, do you want to follow the NASCAR path, so to speak? And I feel like that's what college athletics is doing. In terms of trying to go national, abandon your roots. You know, we want to put races in Phoenix and Las Vegas and this and that. And we're going to let these tracks where this sport started and originated just rot in the countryside. Well, eventually you turn off your base and your customers tune out. And NASCAR learned that the hard way, and they're trying to get back some of what they lost. And I wonder, like, I think college athletics in 20, 30 years could be trying to regain some of what I think it's going to have lost at that point.
Totally agree on that point, for sure. You know, with Duke, I've got a pretty Big 12-centric audience in a lot of ways, being based here in Kansas City. Is there a world where, if the ACC falls apart, Duke could stomach being in the Big 12 if that's a landing spot for them?
I mean, like, in a world where that's maybe the only option, and you know, like, you never know. I mean, who, like, I would say no, that Duke wouldn't want to do that, because Duke, and deservedly so, like, Duke is a fantastic academic institution. It has like endless amount of money in its academic endowment and all this stuff. But if it needs an athletics home, like, you're going to have to make decisions maybe that you don't want to do. And I think ultimately Duke would prefer to be in the Big Ten. And I think if UNC and Duke are going to be together, I think it would have to be in the Big Ten, because I don't think the SEC would take Duke. I would be surprised. Maybe they do. Surprise me. That's just my personal opinion, which, you know, if your listeners don't know, they should know it's not worth all that much. But that's my personal thought on it. But I mean, like, if the Big Ten door is closed for Duke, there's no SEC home. Like, what do you do? I mean, do you stay in a reworked ACC? And I think that's an option for the ACC. Like, if you get down the road years and years from now, you lose Florida State, you lose Clemson, you lose UNC. You know, if you lose Virginia, Miami, some others, can you rework yourself enough to like make it work? I would probably say, and again, all this stuff is just like, you know, completely getting ahead of ourselves, all hypothetical, you know, fun to talk about. But granted, this doesn't really have a basis in reality yet. But I would guess that Duke would prefer to stay in a reworked ACC if they could make that work, as opposed to trying to go to the Big 12. But what, you know, like, who knows? Like, do the remnants of the ACC and Big 12 try to merge? Like, I don't know. You know, like, all sorts of weird things can happen and become possible that maybe we haven't even envisioned yet at this point.
Yeah.
But I would be surprised. Like basketball wise, the Big 12 is great. Duke would fit right in terms of having a basketball presence. I mean, is Kansas still a part of the Big 12? Or there's been rumblings of Kansas getting. I mean, who knows like what these leagues are going to look like or whatever. So I don't know. That's not a fun answer, is it?